Okay, class, today I am going to try to get through 2 PowerPoints for week 5, and this is your in-class recording for week 5 that will be posted on Blackboard. We're covering Creswell, the broad topics of ethical considerations in research and also reliability and validity for qualitative research. But I have merged several slides from a couple other resources, and I've noted that throughout, so I'll stop and talk about those as we cover that. So this is some initial slides in Chapter 3 of our main textbook for the class. That is a review, really, for qualitative research, like the characteristics of qualitative research. So it's worthwhile to just highlight a few things before we get into the ethical considerations. So, qualitative research, a hallmark of qualitative research is that it takes place in its natural setting, that in the environment of the participants that you're interested in studying, that the key vehicle for, and I know you've heard me say this a million times, is the researcher. That researcher is the instrument of data collection. So that's why it's important to bracket and recognize the biases and limitations of the fact that the researcher is the key instrument. And we'll get into specifics of this today, but you increase your reliability and validity of your research when you have multiple methods of data collection and multiple sources of data. You look for patterns, classify things into categories and themes, and it's a bottom-up or inductive approach. And the focus is on either the participant's meaning and understanding or the phenomenon that you're interested in. I think this is actually a good definition of qualitative research. Change my pointer. Sorry about that. Okay. It's an emergent process, meaning it's iterative, and over time things emerge. You can add to the process because you're collecting data in real time and usually the natural settings. Usually when you do qualitative research, it requires extensive time in the field, and you collect a large amount of data that you will later have to analyze. So it is usually a very time-intensive process where you're not in and out and maybe testing one intervention really quickly, like in a quantitative design. So you do have to think about the commitment to the research model and qualitative design. What makes a good qualitative study? Well, really, I've said this over and over, being systematic. So the researcher employs rigorous data collection procedures is a way of being systematic. You know, bracketing and frameworking your approach, meaning your philosophical approach or your interpretive framework or worldview, understanding the research from one of the contexts of the 5 approaches is what Creswell suggests creates a good structure, especially for beginning researchers or student researchers. So picking one of the 5 approaches really gives you structure to your qualitative study, like a case study, like a phenomenological study. Being systematic means you include detailed methods, rich descriptions, multiple methods. And this is a good segue to the next several slides that we're going to cover, which is that you use and employ ethical standards, especially, in all research. And in particular, in qualitative research, you may be participating in the natural environment of the phenomenon or the audience that you're studying. So there are other considerations and ethical considerations that you have to factor in as part of being a good researcher. So Creswell, over the course of the next, let's see, two PowerPoints, has a nice chart in which he outlines where in the process could an ethical issue occur, so prior to the study, at the study, during the study, post data collection, during the reporting of data, and finally when you publish the data. And then he reviews for where in the process an issue could come up, what type of issue is typical, and how you could address it. So I'm just going to cover a few of these. When you read the text, there's more illustrative examples. Let me focus on the data collection piece because you're close to that in your in-class assignment. The idea that you don't want to be disruptive. Say you're doing observations, and being disruptive to that process of the participants in their environment. You have to focus on building trust and not being disruptive to the natural environment as much as possible. Understanding power imbalances. I talked about how if you're doing the study in your work site and you're an administrator, that does create a power imbalance because people may feel compelled to do it as a result of your participation in the research and your status in the organization. So you have to take measures to make sure that a participant feels that they can say they do not wish to volunteer for this research. So you have to look for a balance of power in a research setting in particular, especially in environments that you are participating in. When you're analyzing the data, not disclosing only positive results, but also disclosing maybe a lack of findings. When reporting data, that you're reporting, findings accurately, that you are disclosing evidence that can back up your statements or conclusions. And then when publishing the study, this is kind of a big one. Do not duplicate or piecemeal publications, meaning you usually commit to a journal and you make a commitment that you're only going to be publishing in that journal, not sending it around to 10 journals. You won't face that with your dissertation, but when you go to publish in the research literature, that is considered unethical to take the same data set and try to publish it in multiple journals. So these are just some considerations from a larger scale, ethical considerations. The next several set of slides are focused on the philosophical orientation of the researcher, and I did not intend to review them. But if you are saying, because you do have that section in your dissertation that you have to pick a theoretical framework, then I would suggest that you review it if you're thinking of using a constructivist or interpretive approach to your research, that you look at these in more depth, because it's a nice little plan to construct your outline or your research based on these philosophical orientations. Here's one for transformative approach, interpretive lens, and then this is just a guidepost to give you some, to help frame your thinking around using qualitative procedures. So perhaps you're looking at, we need to better understand a particular topic. You fill in the blank and try to run through your purpose and your research purpose through these 9 arguments and see if perhaps you really should use a qualitative approach to investigate your purpose of your research and your research questions. So it's a good sort of vetting process that you could take your broad topic area, your purpose, and other things that you are thinking of doing for your dissertation and run it through these 9 steps or 9 outlined arguments. It would be a good exercise. And then maybe you'd say, well, perhaps I should, use qualitative procedures for this particular research topic or question. Okay, that's it for Chapter 3, I believe, of Creswell. And now we're talking about Chapter 3 from a book. It's 2007. It's just one summary section called Berg. He's another qualitative researcher. And he talked about historical research that has been less than ethical. And when you do the IRB, the NIH modules, there's some examples within that module. And perhaps you've been exposed to some of the studies that, unfortunately, in a history of our country have been less than stellar periods of our societal judgment in which scientists use deception to keep participants in research studies that cause them harm. So there's some examples of that. A very famous one is the syphilis study. There's many other studies in which, unfortunately, scientists use very extreme deceptive methods and participants were unaware of the risks. So a big factor is disclosing risk, and that is why you go through IRB. It's why you outline specifically the level of risk, and the IRB puts it under specific consideration. And in particular in education, if you intend on studying youth or children, you need parental consent because they are a vulnerable population. And there are other vulnerable populations, such as people who have intellectual developmental disabilities, the elderly, people who maybe are not equipped to make decisions even though they are adults, but maybe not make informed decisions on their behalf. So you have to consider that when you do your IRB application. And another thing that Berg highlights is the idea of being active or passive in consenting to research. So an active research consent is a participant is explained what the research intent is, what the researcher's goal is, how to contact the research. They're given the opportunity to say no, they don't want to participate into the research, and they sign off as an informed consent, a voluntary consent. There really, I've said this in class, is no reason for us to use covert research or deception, and if that is the case, that there's some research question that cannot be fully examined without deceiving the audience, you would have to take very high risk measures through the IRB in order to use covert research. And then the final factor that Berg outlines in the review of some ethical considerations is the confidentiality and anonymity. Now, if we can give a participant full anonymity, meaning you do not know who filled out your survey, completely anonymous, that is the gold standard, that the surveys are identified, de-identified completely. But if for some reason you have to, you're not able to disseminate or conduct your research without knowing the identity of your research participants, then you have to make the information confidential, meaning as little as many people who need to know who've completed and participated in the research as possible will know. And usually that means just you, and you keep that information confidential as the researcher, and you disclose that on the IRB, how you will keep it confidential. But you should always go for anonymous, meaning if you could disseminate a survey, it's pre-identified like ID 1, ID 2, participant 001, participant 002, and just have those sent back to you and they're completely anonymous. That is the higher standard and poses less of a risk for the participant. But if you're unable to completely de-identify information, then you have to keep it confidential with as little shared information of the participants' identifications as possible. And that includes in your write-up, and that includes in any kind of publication. So, for example, there's some times when you have an overrepresentation of one gender versus another, and the setting is just very descriptive that people could maybe by process of elimination know the environment you're talking about, and then from there maybe identify somebody based on other demographic variables. You may have to change the pronouns in your description of the results, in order to keep information confidential. Okay, the next several sections are about validity, and they come from Creswell, but also from another textbook that is really good, a educational research textbook called Gay and Mills. Oops, I'm sorry. Before we get to reliability and validity, I pulled two slides from the Creswell qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods research book. And again, they outline ethical considerations. Actually, these look repetitive, so yeah, I think these are duplicates. They are. I already reviewed these. Okay, so here's Gay's and Gay, Mills, and Arison, and we're going to talk more, and this go right into reliability and validity. So in validity and reliability, here's a definition of validity, in which you are proving the trustworthiness and understanding of your qualitative research. Is the data accurately measuring what is intended to measure, your research questions? And you do that through establishing trustworthiness of the data. And so Gay and Mills outline these 4 steps to establish trustworthiness of data, and that increases your validity. So there's credibility. The report addresses problems that are not easily explained. The transferability. The description provided is such that others can identify the setting. Dependability. The stability of the data is addressed. And confirmability. The neutrality and objectivity of the data is apparent. And looking at trustworthiness. The data is an accurate representation of the phenomenon that you are examining. Some criteria for developing qualitative research validity, and Creswell outlines 5 steps. Descriptive validity, it's actually factually accurate, so any description of the environment and participants are factually accurate. Like, for instance, say you're summarizing demographic variables of a case study for a particular site, and somebody can go back and look at records of the organization and see that your factual account matches records of the organization, for example. Interpretive validity, where a researcher proves that they are interpreting and representing the participants' actions correctly in their data analysis and in their data collection. Theoretical validity, how your data report relates to broader theory. Evaluative validity, whether the report was created with the researcher's judgment. You have the credibility because you've examined the subject matter, so you have that prior knowledge to make conclusions. And generalizability, the degree to which the research could be applied to other settings or similar settings within an organization. And generalizability is probably the type of validity that most people are used to hearing about. Whether or how strong is the generalizability of the results of the research. So Creswell outlines several strategies that could improve your validity for qualitative research. They're all listed here. We talked about several of these in class already. I'll highlight a few. Being a prolonged participation in the study site, not going in and out. I spent 10 minutes in this classroom and then I can make a bunch of conclusions. No, maybe multiple visits into the classroom, multiple data collection methods. Peer debriefing, looking at artifactual data, looking at multiple data sets, having a member check on the data or somebody who is expert in the field check on your data results, all increase the validity of your research findings. Establishing an audit trail, probably have said that a great deal, maybe as often as I say, using triangulation. And to practice reflexivity is to understand the researcher's role and disclose the researcher's role in the research. And that does increase the validity of your findings, to disclose what the researcher's biases may have been and the role in the data collection. But probably the easiest and the most trustworthy is to have triangulation, which is multiple data collection points, and also the idea of an audit trail, authenticating the data collection. some suggestions on how you can improve trustworthiness. I'll just highlight feedback, seeking feedback, maybe collecting data and having another person check your data collection, somebody from your field, somebody from the research methodology perspective, and you have access to a lot of experts in the Department of Education. So seeking feedback, and there are other tips that, Gay and Mills outline. This is from the Gay Mills textbook. So a few things about reliability, and then I'm going to stop the recording here and make a second recording, I believe. I think that's better. Take a little break on the recording. Now, when thinking about reliability, it's defined as the degree to which a study data consistently measures whatever they measure. So qualitative data researchers usually examine the techniques that you use in collecting data, meaning how do you conduct the interviews? How do you do the observations? And that is why using an observation protocol or an interview protocol really improves your reliability because you're being more systematic in the way you're collecting data. A note about generalizability. We talked about generalizability here in terms of validity, but generalizability in terms of reliability, really qualitative researchers acknowledge, because you're going to a very in-depth process and usually looking at a small sample size, that your generalizability is not going to be great. And we accept that as a limitation of qualitative research, but it allows you to be more concerned about the phenomenon. So the researcher can be more concerned with the relevance of the data collection and less concerned about how it applies to other settings. And so you just acknowledge that you have a generalizability, but it lacks a generalizability because it cannot be your results can't be applied to multiple settings. Yeah, this is the last slide from this chapter, and I'm going to stop the recording here and then make a part 2 recording for the next chapter. But I'll just note, because we did talk about this idea of access to sites, and this is what Gay and Mills is talking about here when they say guidelines for entry into research settings. You really need that to be very conscientious about the environments that you're entering and not take for granted that everybody is very willing and wants to participate in your research. Of course, people want to and they should volunteer for your research. But even then, they may be nervous. They may not be at ease. And so they just offer these tips to help you, make sure that the access to your environment, and especially in people's natural settings, that you ease into the setting, that you observe more than you participate. Even though you can be participatory, you must acknowledge that in your research writing that you are participatory, but really you're trying to get a sense of involvement with your participants. So you want to be friendly, you want to be polite, you want to do not take what happens personally, meaning if you think everybody in my school building is going to volunteer to do my survey and you realize only 20% did, it really is not because they don't want to do your research. Maybe they're busy. So don't take it personally. It's just part of understanding that we have to be mindful that we're given access to a research environment. Even if it's an environment we work in, we should be respectful of the participants in that setting. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording here and get back with you guys on the next recording.